The text came in while I was pulling a tray of biscuits out of the oven, and I burned 2 fingers reaching for the phone before I even set the pan down. It was from my daughter. 3 lines. "It's better if you don't come to the opening. Too many moving parts. I'll explain later." I stood there in my kitchen with the oven door still hanging open, heat pouring out against my legs, and I read it again like the words might rearrange themselves into something kinder. They didn't. My daughter was opening her restaurant in 9 days. The restaurant she'd been building toward her whole life, the one that had her name in the paper twice already. And I wasn't invited, not to the dinner before, not to the party after, not to any of it. I closed the oven. I ran my fingers under the cold tap until the sting faded. Then I sat down at the table where I've eaten alone for 6 years now since my husband passed, and I looked at that phone lying face down on the placemat like something I didn't want to touch again. I'm 69. I ran a diner on Route 9 for 31 years before my knees and the rent made the decision for me. I know how to feed 200 people in a snowstorm with half a staff. I know how to make a man who's just lost his job feel like the coffee's on the house without ever saying it out loud. I raised one daughter in the back booth of that place, her homework spread across the vinyl, her feet not yet reaching the floor. And now, apparently, none of that was welcome in the room where she'd be shaking hands with food critics. I didn't cry. I want that on the record. Not right then. What I did was get up, wrap the biscuits in a towel so they wouldn't go hard, and stand at the window looking out at the yard where the grass needed cutting. I told myself there had to be a reason. She'd said too many moving parts. Maybe there truly were. Maybe she was drowning in it, the way you drown in the last week before something big, and she'd sent that message in a panic and would call me that night to take it back. She didn't call that night. She didn't call the next. I have a way of talking myself down from things, and I put it to work. I decided it wasn't personal. I decided she was overwhelmed. I even decided for about an hour that I understood that a woman deserves to have her big night go the way she pictured it, without her old mother in the corner in a dress from a catalog. I've always been good at deciding to feel fine. But there's a difference between deciding and feeling, and around the 3rd day the deciding wore thin. I went into the spare room where I keep the things I can't seem to give away. There's a box up on the shelf with her name on it in marker that's gone brown with age. I took it down. Inside were her report cards, a macaroni necklace, a Mother's Day card she made in the 2nd grade that said, "You are the best cooker in the whole world." And underneath all of that, a stack of index cards in a child's careful print. She used to sit at the diner counter after close and copy down my recipes. She said she was going to have her own place someday and she'd need to know how I did the pie crust, the chili, the buttermilk dressing nobody could ever get right off of me. I'd stand behind her, guiding her spelling, and she'd get frustrated and press so hard the pen tore the card. There were a dozen of them in that box, torn in the same spot, and I sat on the floor of the spare room and held them, and that's when I finally cried. Not loud, just the kind that leaks out of you when you're not looking. She'd learned everything she knew standing next to me, and now she couldn't have me standing next to her for one night. I put the cards back. I put the box back on the shelf. I washed my face in the bathroom and looked at myself in the mirror, at the woman who used to be quick and was now just slow, and I told her to stop. Stop imagining. Stop hoping the phone would ring. I didn't tell anyone. That's the thing I'm least proud of. My neighbor down the road came by with tomatoes from her garden and asked if I was going to the big opening. Everybody in town was talking about it, our own girl on the food page, and I smiled and said something about not being sure my knees were up for the drive to the city. She patted my hand. I let her think what she wanted. It's a strange kind of shame, being uninvited by your own child. You carry it low, where nobody can see. I'd already bought a dress. I'd bought it weeks before, when I still thought I'd be sitting at a front table watching my daughter's dream come true. It was a soft gray, the color of the sky before rain, with little covered buttons up the front. I'd even found earrings, my mother's earrings actually. Small pearls I'd had cleaned at the shop in town. I took the dress out of the closet and laid it across the bed and looked at it, and then I hung it back up and pushed it to the far end of the rod where I wouldn't have to see it. 4 days before the opening, I drove into the city to the restaurant supply warehouse. I still bake, for the farmer's market on Saturdays, mostly pies and loaves out of my own kitchen, and I needed parchment and a few tins, and I'll be honest, part of me wanted to be near where she was. Not to be seen, just to breathe the same air for an hour. I was reaching for a case of quarter-sheet pans when a woman near me was doing the same, and we bumped hands, and we both laughed the way you do. She was around my age, maybe a little older, tall, with hair gone completely white and cut short, and a coat that had been good once and was still holding up. She had a list written on the back of an envelope. You cook for a living? She asked me. Used to, I said. You? My whole life. My son says I should stop. She said it lightly, but there was something under it. You know how they get once they think they've made it. Suddenly everything you did was small. I don't know what made me say it. Maybe because she was a stranger, and strangers are the only ones you can tell the truth to sometimes. My daughter's making it right now, as a matter of fact. Opening a place this week. The woman went very still. She set down her list. Which place? I told her the name. Her face did something I'll never forget. A kind of quiet collapse, then a hard recovery, like a door blown open by wind and then pushed shut against it. That's my son's fiancée, she said. We stood in the middle of that warehouse, the two of us, cartwheels squeaking past on the concrete, and it all came out sideways. Her son and my daughter were engaged. They'd been together 3 years. The restaurant was, in part, his money. His and some investors. There was going to be a whole evening of it, dinner for the important people, then a party. And she, the mother of the man footing a good part of the bill, had been told gently that it might be simpler if she didn't attend. She said my accent doesn't play well with the crowd they're courting, the woman told me. Her name was Delphine. That's how she put it. Doesn't play well. Like I'm a bad song. She laughed, but it caught in her throat. I raised that boy in a 2-room apartment over a laundromat. I ironed other people's shirts so he could go to a good school. And now my accent doesn't play well. I told her about the biscuits. About the text. About the recipe cards torn in the same spot. We ended up sitting in her car in the warehouse parking lot for an hour and a half. 2 grown women who'd never met, passing a bag of cough drops back and forth because neither of us had anything else, and our mouths were dry from talking. I learned that her son had started introducing her, at his fancier events, as a friend of the family. I learned that she'd found out, from a caterer she happened to know, that the opening's press materials described my daughter as self-taught, from humble beginnings, a chef who built everything with her own 2 hands. Self-taught, I said, and something in my chest went cold and clear. She wasn't self-taught, she was taught by me, standing on a milk crate to reach the flat top. That's the trouble, Delphine said quietly. You're the evidence. So am I. We're the part of the story they've decided to leave out. If we're there, the story doesn't hold. I've turned that sentence over more times than I can count. You're the evidence, she was right. It wasn't that my daughter hated me. It wasn't that Delphine's son had turned cruel overnight. It was worse in a way, and simpler. We were proof that the tidy story they were selling wasn't true. 2 women from small kitchens and cramped apartments, and they'd built themselves up by pretending they'd risen from nothing. But we were the nothing. We were the something the nothing was supposed to be. And you can't have the evidence walking around the party. Delphine reached over and put her hand on my arm. Her hand was strong, warped a little at the knuckles the way hands get from decades of hot water and heavy pans. Mine looks the same. Come with me, she said. Where? To the opening. As my guest. My son gave me 2 seats before all this, when he still remembered who I was. I never gave the second one back. I laughed, the first real laugh I'd had in a week. They'll throw us both out. Let them try, Delphine said. I've been thrown out of nicer places by better people. I drove home that night and I didn't sleep. I lay in the dark arguing with myself. It was undignified. What kind of mother crashes her own daughter's opening? I'd raised her to have manners. Where were mine? And underneath all that sensible fear was something else. Something I'd tamped down for so long I barely recognized it. I was angry. Not the flimsy anger that burns off in an hour. The deep kind. The kind that had been sitting at the bottom of me, getting heavier for years. Every time she corrected the way I said certain words, every time she rushed me off the phone, every time she skipped a Christmas and sent a gift card instead. I got up around 4 and made coffee and sat at the table and thought about all the mornings I'd opened that diner at 5, alone in the dark, flipping the sign, starting the burners, feeding truckers and nurses coming off shift, and once memorably, a whole wedding party whose reception hall had lost power. I thought about who I'd been, and I realized I hadn't been small. I'd been the opposite of small. I'd been the thing everybody in that town could count on. Somewhere along the way, I'd let my own daughter convince me I was an embarrassment, and I'd agreed to it. I'd folded myself down to fit in the corner she'd cut out for me. I took the gray dress out of the closet. I steamed the wrinkles out. I found my mother's earrings. Delphine picked me up the night of the opening because she said her old sedan would look less out of place among the valleys than my truck. And she was right. And we both found that hilarious in a way that helped with the nerves. She wore navy, a beautiful navy, and I told her so, and she said she'd bought it for a wedding that got 20 years ago and had been waiting for the right occasion. This is it, she said. This is the right occasion. The restaurant was downtown, in a building that used to be a bank. They'd kept the marble in the tall windows and hung enormous lights that looked like clouds made of glass. There was a line of cars. There were people out front in clothes that cost more than I used to make in a month, holding little glasses, their faces bright with the pleasure of being somewhere important. Delphine took my arm at the door, or I took hers. I honestly can't remember which of us reached first. We must have looked like two old friends, and I suppose by then we were. A young man in a black jacket checked a list on a tablet, found Delphine's name, hesitated at the +1, and Delphine said, in a voice smooth as a river stone, "She's with me," and there was something in how she said it that made the boy simply nod and wave us through. Inside, the noise wrapped around us. A string trio in the corner, waiters gliding with trays, the smell of butter and char and something green and bright I couldn't name, and under it, faintly, the smell of my own daughter's cooking, which I would know blindfolded in a crowd of 1,000 kitchens, because it started as mine. For a moment, nobody looked at us. We were just two well-dressed older women in a room full of people trying to be seen. We got glasses of something sparkling that neither of us drank. We stood near a pillar. My heart was going hard enough that I pressed my hand flat against my chest, and Delphine noticed and leaned in and said, "Low, breathe out. Not in. Out. You're already full of air." And I laughed and it worked. Then I saw her. My daughter was across the room in a dark green dress, her hair up, laughing at something a man in glasses was saying, and she was radiant. I want to be honest even here. My first feeling, before the hurt, before the anger, was pride. That's my girl, I thought. The way you can't help it, the way it's stitched into you at a level below thought. That's my girl, and look at her, look what she made. I'd have given anything in that second to just walk over and cup her face in my hands like I did when she was small and say, "You did it, you actually did it." And then a woman near her turned and saw us, and said something, and my daughter followed the woman's eyes across the room and found me. I watched her face fall through several things, very fast, confusion, then recognition, then something that was almost fear. She excused herself from the man in glasses and started toward us. And the closer she got, the more composed she made herself, until by the time she reached us, her face was perfectly smooth, a hostess's face, a stranger's. "What are you doing here?" she said. Not loud. She'd never make a scene. She'd learned that much from watching me keep the peace in a room full of tired people. "I told you it was better if you didn't come." "You did," I said, "and I heard you. But I'm not here as your guest. I'm here as hers." I nodded at Delphine. My daughter looked at Delphine, and something passed between them, some understanding, and I watched her realize that the two women she'd tried hardest to erase had found each other. That we'd compared notes. That we knew. "You need to keep your voice down," she said to me, though I hadn't raised it. "I haven't said a word above a whisper," I said. "I'm just standing in a room, that's all. I'll stand right here quietly and drink this drink I'm not going to drink, and I'll leave when your guest is ready to leave." I gestured at Delphine again. "Enjoy your night. It's a beautiful place. You always did have a good eye." I meant it too. That was the strange part. I wasn't trying to wound her. I'd come to be seen, not to fight. And I think that's what unsettled her most, that I wasn't there to make a scene, or beg or shame her. I was just there. Standing, existing where she'd told me not to. Her fiancé appeared then, at her elbow, and he saw his mother and his whole face changed, and for 1 second, he looked like a boy. Delphine put her hand up to his cheek before he could say anything, and she said, "I came to see what you built. It's very fine. Your father would have been proud." And whatever he'd been about to say died in his throat, and he just stood there with his mother's hand on his face in the missile of his own party. My daughter told us tightly to enjoy the evening. She said it the way you say a thing you don't mean because there are people watching. And she turned and walked back into the crowd, and her fiancé followed after a moment, glancing back at his mother twice. Delphine and I found a small table near the windows. We sat. My legs were shaking and I let them under the tablecloth where nobody could see. The party went on around us like weather, and a funny thing happened. People started coming over. An older investor who remembered eating at a diner like mine in his youth and wanted to talk about pie. A young cook on break who'd heard somebody say I was the chef's mother and wanted to shake my hand, whose eyes went wide when I told her, yes. I taught her. She used to stand on a crate. A food writer who sat down uninvited and asked me questions. I answered plainly. About the diner, about 31 years, about what my daughter was like at 10, and I saw the writer's pen moving and thought, well, the story's got a little more truth in it now. We stayed 2 hours. We ate, actually, and it was good. It was so good it made my throat tight, because I could taste myself in it. The buttermilk, the char, the way she finished a sauce, all of it learned at my counter. When we left, Delphine and we walked out arm in arm the same way we'd walked in, past the glass clouds and the marble, and out into the cold, and we stood on the sidewalk, and we laughed until we had to hold on to each other. Laughed like girls, laughed until the valet asked if we were all right, and we said we'd never been better, which was almost true. I thought that would be the end of it. I thought I'd done my one brave thing and I'd go home and go quiet again. But something had come loose in me that night, and it didn't go back. The Saturday after at the farmer's market, I set up my table the way I always do, pies and loaves under the little canopy, and I found I was standing straighter. I found I was talking more. A girl came by, maybe 13, in a hand-me-down coat, and she stood a long time looking at my pies without buying, the way a kid does when they want something they can't have, and I recognized that look because I'd worn it myself once. I cut her a slice and told her it was the end of the batch and I'd only throw it out otherwise, which was a lie, and she ate it standing there and told me it was the best thing she'd ever had. Her name was Marnie. She came back the next Saturday, and the one after. Turned out she lived with her grandmother a few streets over and nobody at home had time to cook, and she was hungry in a way that wasn't only about food. The third Saturday I asked if she wanted to learn how the crust was done, and she looked at me like I'd offered her the moon. So on Sundays now she comes to my kitchen. She's a natural. Quick hands, no fear of the hot oven, the good kind of stubbornness. I stand behind her the way I once stood behind my own daughter, guiding, correcting, and I've caught myself getting choked up over a bowl of dough more than once, and Marnie pretends not to notice, which is its own kind of kindness. Delphine and I talk on the phone most evenings. She drives out to see me on the weekends sometimes, and we sit on my back porch with tea and no need to fill every silence. We've become the family we each got left out of. She calls me the night before the market to ask what I'm baking, and I tell her, and she tells me I work too hard, and I tell her she's one to talk, and we're both right and neither of us stops. I never got an apology. I want to be honest about that, because I know how these stories are supposed to go, and mine doesn't go that way. There was no tearful phone call. My daughter didn't show up on my doorstep in the rain. The restaurant did well. I read about it. There was a piece in the paper a few weeks later, and buried in it was a line about how the chef learned to cook in her mother's roadside diner. And I don't know if the writer put that in on her own or if something shifted, but I clipped it out and I keep it in the box with the recipe cards. It's the first time in years I've seen the truth of me printed anywhere near her name. She did come, eventually. On a Tuesday in the fall, no warning, the way she does everything. I was rolling out dough for the next morning and I heard a car and looked up and it was her, standing in my kitchen doorway in city clothes, looking at the flour on my apron and the tins cooling on the rack. "It smells the same in here," she said. "It should," I said. "It's the same recipes." She came in and sat at the table where she'd done her homework 30 years ago. She didn't take her coat off. She looked at her hands a long time. "I didn't hate you," she finally said. "It was never that." "I know," I said, "and I did know by then. You needed me not to exist so the story would work. That's a different thing, not better, but different." She flinched a little at that, but she didn't argue, and I respected her for not arguing. "I was ashamed," she said, "not of you, of where I came from. And I couldn't tell the difference anymore between the two." She looked up at me. "That's not an excuse." "No," I said, "it isn't. But it's the truth, and the truth is worth more than an excuse." I slid the dough into the tin. My hands didn't shake. "I'm not angry anymore if that's what you came to find out." I let it go somewhere around the second Sunday I spent teaching a hungry kid to bake. There wasn't room for both. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "The fiancé's mother, Delphine, he talks about her differently now. He goes out to see her. Something changed after that night." "Good," I said. Some things needed changing. She stayed maybe half an hour. She didn't ask to come back, and I didn't ask her to. And I've made my peace with the fact that we may never be what we were, back when her feet didn't reach the floor of the booth. Some things, once they crack, don't glue back the way the child in you wants them to. But she came. She sat in my kitchen and told me the truth, and before she left she stood in the doorway and looked at the recipe box on the shelf, and she said, "You kept those." "I kept everything," I said. She nodded, and her eyes were wet, and she didn't wipe them, which was maybe the bravest thing she did all evening. Then she left. No promises, just a car pulling out of a gravel drive and the quiet coming back down. I finished the dough, I set the timer. I turned on the little radio I keep by the window, the one my husband bought me decades ago that still gets exactly 2 stations. And I stood in my warm kitchen in the dark and I felt, of all things, whole. Here's what I've learned. And I'll say it plainly because I've spent too much of my life saying things sideways. For years, I believed my worth was in being needed. I opened at 5 for the people who needed the coffee. I raised a daughter who needed raising. When she stopped needing me, I thought I'd stopped being anything at all, and I shrank myself to match. But being needed and being worth something are not the same, and it took getting uninvited from the biggest night of my daughter's life to finally understand that. I didn't walk into that party to be let back in. I walked in because I'd decided I was done asking permission to be a person. If you're listening to this and someone has made you feel like the part of the story they'd rather leave out, like the evidence they'd rather bury, I want you to hear me. You are not the thing that came before the good part. You are the good part. You are the crate the child stood on to reach. And you are allowed to walk into any room you please, arm in arm with whoever finds you worth the walk, and stand there quietly, taking up your rightful space, until the whole room remembers what it forgot. I keep the recipe cards on the shelf. I keep the clipping in the box. And on Sundays, there's a girl in my kitchen with flour on her nose, and I stand behind her, and I am exactly as much as I ever was.